What does it take to get approved for Mexican residency? In this video, come along with my wife and I as we walk through the process of applying for and getting approved for Mexican residency at our local consulate, including gathering all the documents, making the appointments, preparing for, and the experiences of going through the interviews at the consulate. We, like thousands of others, are leaving our home countries in Canada and the United States and seeking a life in Latin America. This channel is about sharing those experiences, the highs and the lows, and what we learn along the way to make your journey easier. I researched the Mexican residency requirements on the website of our local consulate, and we do seem to qualify. And they seem pretty straightforward. I think I read them 100 times. I would encourage you to look up the requirements for your local consulate, as interestingly enough, it seems like they differ from consulate to consulate just a little bit. So let's go and see how it happened. After researching the requirements, the first step was to book an appointment at our local consulate. Now, this seemed a little cumbersome at first, and I called the consulate and eventually got a hold of somebody that told me I needed to book this online. It was a little difficult to find on the website, but I was able to find the appointment booking site. I know there have been some changes to this constantly, but I was able to book an appointment. It was some weeks out, and so then we had a little bit of time to prepare. Now, with the appointment looming on my calendar, now's time to prepare all the documentation that's required. Now, at first, this seemed really simple. But then sitting down to do it, it was considerably, at least in our case, quite a bit more complicated. It seems that Mexico simply wants to make sure that you, the new immigrant, is not going to be a financial drain on their country. And so there are two ways to qualify for this: to either show financial assets, bank accounts, investment accounts, just cash assets, or to show income that's sufficient to sustain your life in Mexico. And well, there's a third way to qualify, but that's a totally different video. The first way is to prove an average monthly balance cumulative of your financial assets, so bank accounts, investment accounts, etc., of $55,655. That's for our local consulate, and that's an average balance over the last 12 months. Now, your consulate may be slightly different, but the amounts should be very similar, but they are changing over time. It's one of the things that prompted us to go ahead and do this now, as these amounts seem to have been rising. When I first started watching this, it was around $45,000 Canadian. Now it's like $55,000 Canadian. And as we've watched residency programs around the world, these amounts tend to, as they become more popular, tend to rise. Now, the way they come up with these numbers, it's a certain multiple of the daily minimum wage in Mexico. And as minimum wage in Mexico is rising, particularly with inflation, and with the changes in exchange rates between the Mexican peso and your currency, these amounts can vary over time. So just keep tabs as you're going through this process. So on the surface, this seems really easy to calculate. You just enter the monthly balance for 12 months and then just click on the average. Well, when I started doing that, then I realized, do I put the opening balance? Do I put the closing balance? Or do I open up a massive spreadsheet with 365 lines and enter a daily balance for each account for each day of the year and then average out the average daily balance for the year? It was quite complicated, and I really wasn't able to get a really solid answer on this, so I just picked one. I believe it was the opening balance, or was it the closing balance? I just picked a day and just went with those numbers, and I just had to try it and see if that would work, because I really couldn't get a good answer from anybody. I really don't think they knew what I was asking. It even got more complicated because some of the accounts simply had quarterly statements. Others were like crypto accounts, and how do you calculate the balances there? Because I can show the number of Bitcoin, but what was it worth at any particular time, or the Ethereum? It can be fairly complicated, and you're just going to have to pick a number and just do the best you can to document it. Ours got even more complicated because I have some in our personal name, some joint names, some joint with partners, some are in corporations. So I ended up collecting a fair bit of paperwork. And as the pile got greater, I started organizing it into different sections. Stuff in my personal name, stuff that was my wife's name, stuff that was in joint names. And the stuff that's in joint names, you can make a determination of like, okay, so much of this is actually going to me, or so much is going to my wife, because depending on who needed more to qualify. And the way we qualified individually, each separately. rather than me qualifying, getting my residency, and then showing up with my wife in Mexico and saying, I'm a resident, I need a residency for my wife, which I understand also works, but we were able to qualify both ourselves, and so we just went ahead with that. As I gathered paperwork, I included like copies of the articles of incorporation for our corporation, and all those details. I had summary spreadsheets, summary pages on top of each section. I made 2 copies of everything, the originals, and then a copy so that they could keep a copy, which turns out they didn't, but they asked for it. A bit of a side note, we have held quite a bit of real estate over the years, and apparently real estate does not, as far as financial assets go, help you to qualify. But if you're qualifying on income basis, the income from rental properties does help you qualify. Go figure. Now, let me know if you've had a different experience, but it seems that people can use income from their job in Canada, which they'll ostensibly be leaving when they move to Mexico, but use that income to qualify for residency in Mexico. Now, I believe I've heard some people had some challenges with that, and others have just used it and never been questioned about it. But I guess you'll have to use whatever you have, and many people seem to be getting approved on that basis. Now, many of you with a job are simply able to collect your 12 pay stubs with the withholding taxes and show that your net income at the end. You got a 12 pay stubs, you got a little tiny little stack of paper, done. With us, it's quite a bit complicated. We're business people and operate a business and at times several businesses. And so this was quite a bit more complicated for us. A little bit more on that, because the income is supposed to be after-tax income, and I'm showing income that's now, of course, over the past 12 months before tax income, because this hasn't been, tax hasn't been filed on that income yet. I had to include, I used third-party tax estimators, so I could plug in all the income and fill out the tax estimator and come up with an estimate of after-tax income. At the end of the day, I don't know if they actually really looked at it, but I went overboard because I didn't want to do this twice. Probably was overdoing it, but I thought if one method failed, I would go try the other. So I actually prepared both. I prepared the income requirement showing I had after-tax income that met the requirements, and asset requirements showing I had cash assets to meet the cash asset requirements. And so you can see that the paper pile is actually growing. It was pretty big. The stack of paper was rather impressive. There's no way I was carrying this in a briefcase. I actually had to empty out my ski bag, all my ski gear, and pile it all in there. I was pretty stressed about this whole thing. I wanted to get it done. My wife was just like totally relaxed. No problem. Of course, she had a stack of paper this big, and mine was like this big. So it was pretty easy for her, but it was quite a bit more complicated for me. But there's no way I was doing this again. Now, of course, being super plan ahead, I was all very, very well prepared. I booked the appointment. It was several weeks out, and I actually didn't get around to collecting all the documentation until just a few days before. So it was a stressful few days as I was trying to figure all this out. With suddenly it was more complicated than I was thinking it was. And so there's a couple late nights as I was gathering all this impressive pile of paper, which at the end turned out to our favor, I think. Now, we had an appointment at 1:30 p.m. at the Consulate in nearest us. It's in Calgary, Alberta. Well, it was actually a little bit difficult to find the Consulate. So the address, the buildings in Calgary, a lot of these are connected. So you park in a parkade in one, and you go up into the building, and you are actually in the building next door. You didn't think there was the building you're in, and you walk through a doorway, and next thing you know, you're in a different building. And then when we did find the right building, we had trouble finding the elevator core. So a little bit of scurrying around because we wanted to get there on time. We arrived kind of in the nick of time just to find out that, of course, it's Mexican Consulate. They're still up for lunch. They weren't worried about the time at all. The Consulate itself was a little bit Spartan, like really, really low key. Just a really simple place. And the lady at the front desk didn't speak that much English, but she was really friendly and helpful. So I'd practiced in Spanish, and I'll probably have to read it now, but I'd practiced asking for my appointment when I arrived. So I arrived and said, Yo tengo un cita para mi residencia con mi esposa a las 1:30. So I have an appointment for a residency with my wife at 1:30. Yeah, she didn't understand me very well, so I probably should have read it to her because I was probably a little nervous. So I had to resort to English, but she realized we were there for a residency appointment, no problem. And so she sat us down to wait and then started us through the process. Now, in some ways, the experience at the Mexican Residency was very official, which is sort of normal for Latin American countries, it seems. But in other ways, it was more casual and relaxed than I would have expected at a Canadian government office or a U.S. consulate. It still makes me laugh when the receptionist, as she was getting us started, asked for our paperwork, and I opened up my ski bag and dropped this 14-inch pile of paper under her outstretched arms, and she was kind of staggered under the weight of it all. Just makes me giggle a little bit now. There it was. She had our paperwork, and then I handed her the little tiny stack for my wife. One interesting thing is on the website at the time, it said that the fee that we needed to pay at the consulate was $62 Canadian. Well, there must have been a change in the peso. Although this was on, as of the night before, on the website at $62, and we had cash ready. There was a change. It was actually $63 that was required in cash. And so we were scurrying through, digging through my wife's purse, trying to find another $2. And thank you, Superstore, for requiring a dollar coin in the shopping carts because we had a couple. Another kind of funny thing was the receipt for the money that we paid, our $63. In Canada or United States, I know they would have entered into a computer, and there was a computer receipt would have come out and would have been this fancy stamp or whatever on it. So very practical. But in Mexico, they had a sheet of paper that they'd photocopied, and each strips of the piece of paper had like like a blank receipt. And so she simply took out a pair of scissors and cut off 2 strips off this photocopied piece of paper and hand wrote our receipt on these little strips of paper. Totally practical, but very Mexican. It was awesome. So we waited a little bit in the waiting room for probably 10 or 15 minutes till everybody got back from lunch. And then my wife first was called in for her photos and fingerprints. And then it was probably 10 or 20 minutes later, I was called in for the same thing. And hey, they even told us that we could smile for our photos. And we had brought photos. So they asked us for photos, like a passport photo. It has to be a specific size. And I honestly don't know of anywhere that photo was used. It wasn't in the visa that we received at the consulate that I can tell. And it wasn't on the photo that eventually ended up on our Mexican residency cards in Mexico. Don't know what they did with them. We had to bring, was it 2 or 3 of them, and they took one, and the extra copy I still have. We don't know. We don't know. So we waited for about another half hour, and we just sat in the waiting room. We were visiting with another Canadian couple with their family that were doing the same thing. And so we just chatted with them for about half an hour. And then we got called in for our interviews together. And I was quite nervous about how this interview was going to go. And though our lawyer, and I'll introduce you more to her later, our lawyer from Mexico had prepared us. And she just kept telling us to relax. It was going to be no big deal. But I was pretty nervous as we were called in for an interview and trying to figure out, what questions they were going to grill us with. We were ushered into a sparsely furnished but rather stately still office of a senior staff member. Although he sat behind a sheet of plexiglass, he shook our hands and ushered us into his office to sit down without even wearing a mask, which was more customary at that time. There was a large Mexican flag in the office. It was really cool. And a note on the side table, I saw my huge pile of paperwork sitting there. I actually asked him about the pile of paper. I commented. I said, "Oh, there's my paperwork right there." And this was on a Friday afternoon. Now it's about 2:30 or so. And he just looked at it and looked at me and goes, "Yeah, and you can take it with you too." I honestly don't think they even looked at it. I thought they probably looked at this massive pile and said, "Dude, is documented and over documented, and there's no way I'm going to be late for cerveza time at the end of the workday on Friday afternoon because I'm going through this guy's paperwork. He obviously qualifies, stamp." So they really only ask us 2 questions. Why do you want Mexican residency? And each of you can have your own answer for that. It was just a pretty simple answer that we just, want to slow down, have a free life in Mexico, and just look forward to semi-retirement. The second question he asked us is, do you plan to buy a home right away? never thought about the question before, and I just said, well, probably not right away. We'll probably rent for a while, as we really don't know where we want to live exactly, so we'll rent for a while we try to figure out, where we want to be. And he seemed satisfied with both those answers. And that interview lasted less than a minute. And he said, okay, you qualify for Mexican residency. Now, upon qualifying, he told us that we had 180 days to enter the country and attend an appointment at a Mexican immigration office in Mexico. And he kind of blindsided us a little bit by telling us that we would need to be in Mexico for 2 to 3 months to fulfill this part of the process. And that freaked us out a little bit because we were not then ready to be full-time residents right immediately in Mexico. It'll take some time to unwind our life in Canada and to prepare to be full-time Mexican residents. We were prepared to travel right away, but we were not prepared to be there for 2 or 3 months. We could be there weeks or a month, but we couldn't be there 2 or 3 months. And it did freak me out quite a lot, but we just stuffed it, went through the rest of the process, and figured we'd figure the rest of this out later. How he'd explained it, and there's been a lot of changes at the immigration in Mexico. So he basically said, when you arrive in Mexico, don't go in the tourists line to go through immigration. Go into the Mexicans line at immigration, and you have to get the correct stamp in your passport and your FNM. And there's been some changes there too, which we'll go into in another video. But only then are you allowed to book an appointment at a Mexican immigration office, which could be sometime down the road still. And so that's why he said 2 to 3 months. Turns out there was another way, and even that is changing. So we were able to get through it, and we didn't spend 3 months in Mexico. I was honestly struggling on how we were going to overcome this one. We had applied for Mexican residency now because we were watching the requirements keep changing, and we saw, as I mentioned earlier, other programs around the world either going away, like the Friendly Nations visa in Panama, and others were just simply changing their requirements and becoming more and more difficult as they were getting more and more applicants for residency. Now, I told my wife not to worry, but inside I was freaking out a little bit. How are we going to do this? We couldn't spend that long in Mexico right then. We still have family here. So I was just really trying to figure this out, but I just didn't want to let this guy know that I was freaking out about it. And so we just said, oh, that's great. We'll figure it out. So I reached out to our lawyer in Merida, Yesenia. Within hours, she got back to us with appointments booked with a date and time. Good to have somebody on your side that's connected on the inside, that knows the system and knows what to do, and it can help and advise you. I don't know what we would have done if we were going through this process on our own. And I'm going to put Yesenia's information down below. And she's going to come on the channel and just walk us through the process from the lawyer standpoint as well. So I'll look for that further. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Okay, so the next step in the next video goes on to our trip to Mexico. You're going to get to come along with us as we actually make the flight and travel to Mexico, and then eventually attend our immigration appointment. What we were given is a 1-year residency, so 1-year temporary residency in Mexico, and then we need to return on the anniversary or just prior to that 1 year. And don't really know why they do this exactly, but you attend, there's no more requirements, you don't have to do anything but show up, and that's what we're told. And then we'll be issued a 3-year temporary residency permit. And then at the end of that 3 years, again, we return to immigration and we'll be given a permanent residency for Mexico, which there's a few more rights there, I understand, with a permanent residency, with accessing the Mexican healthcare system, rights to work, etc. And further, I think 1 year after that, if you can pass the Spanish exam and the Mexican history exam, then you can actually get a Mexican passport. But most people don't go beyond the permanent residency. They just want to live there, have the rights to permanently live in Mexico, and with a permanent residency, you're good to go, unless you want to go further and vote and have that extra passport for travel. And that's, I think, the vast majority of people, that's as far as they go. So we're learning all this stuff. We're not expert in anything. We're just learning how to get residency, and then you just come along with us on these videos as we go to Mexico, go through the process of getting our residency, explore different cities, the fun things to do, the challenges, neighborhoods you might want to live in, how to go to a restaurant, how to get around the country, etc. It's kind of a fun journey. It's pretty varied, all the different experiences. We go to a bunch of different parts of the country in the next videos. It'll be fun. Come along. And we really appreciate you putting your comments down below, because many of you know way more than we do. And if you have questions, put it down here, and if we can't answer it, we'll reach out to get answers for you. We've met so many people, experts, real estate experts, legal experts, just people that know so many different things about Mexico, people that have lived there for a long time or have recently gone through the process as well, so they've shared their information with us. So come along, it'll be fun. So make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we'll see you on the next video. And remember, vive libre.